Washington, D.C., Fort Myer Military Post, June 1919. The celebration had been planned for weeks, every detail arranged with the precision that the United States Army applied to its formal ceremonies. The kind of precision that was, in many ways, the peacetime substitute for the precision required in actual combat. White-gloved hands, pressed dress uniforms, medals aligned with mathematical exactness on chests that had earned them in fields thousands of miles from this manicured ground. Flags standing perfectly vertical in the windless evening air. A military band playing selections that managed to be simultaneously celebratory and solemn, which was the specific emotional register that the American Army preferred for occasions where it was commemorating something that had required enormous human sacrifice to achieve. The Great War was over. 8 months had passed since the armistice. The men gathered here tonight had survived the trenches, the gas, the artillery barrages, the machine gun positions that cut entire platoons down before they had advanced 20 yards. They had crossed the Atlantic, entered a conflict that had already consumed millions of European lives, and done what was asked of them. Now they were home, and tonight was one of the ceremonies through which the institution processed the transition from what had just ended to whatever would come next. George S. Patton stood near the edge of the gathering. He was 33 years old, lieutenant colonel by rank, a title he had earned not through administrative patience, but through combat command of the 1st Tank Brigade at Saint-Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne. He had been wounded in the latter, shot through the left leg while standing in open ground directing his tanks forward, refusing to take cover while his men were exposed. He had continued issuing commands for several minutes after being hit, before allowing himself to be carried from the field. The wound had removed him from the final weeks of the war. He had arrived in France burning to fight and had spent the armistice in a hospital bed, which was its own particular kind of wound for a man built the way Patton was built. He was, in physical terms, exactly what a military ceremony was designed to display. 6 feet tall, ramrod posture, a jaw that seemed carved from the same material as a rifle stock, eyes that were pale and direct and carried, even in conversation, the quality of a man assessing ground. He wore his uniform the way a soldier wears something he believes in, rather than something required of him. His medals were there. Not many yet, but each one understood by anyone present who knew what the ribbons represented. But George Patton at a ceremony was never entirely comfortable. This was a consistent truth about him that his friends understood, and his critics occasionally exploited. He was built for movement, for decision, for the compressed intensity of situations where every second contained a consequence. Ceremonies were the opposite of that. They were deliberate, measured, repetitive. They honored what had already happened, rather than determining what would happen next. He respected their purpose. He attended them with the required seriousness. But some part of him was always somewhere else. Tonight, somewhere else meant 1918 France. The smell of diesel from the tanks, the noise of artillery fire that was sometimes impossible to distinguish from thunder. The particular quality of his own mind in those moments of forward movement when everything that was complicated became simple, because the only question that mattered was the next correct decision, and the next one after that. The ceremony progressed through its formal stages, speeches, the presentation of commendations, a moment of silence for those who had not returned. Patton participated in each stage with appropriate gravity. He was capable of ceremony when it was required. He simply preferred not to require it. It was during the reception that followed, when the formal structure dissolved into smaller conversations, and the wine began to flow with slightly more freedom than Army protocol technically endorsed, that he encountered Major General Harold Whitmore. Whitmore was 61 years old, a career soldier of the old school, commissioned in the 1880s, a veteran of the Indian Wars, the Spanish-American War, and the Philippine-American War that followed it. He had served with competence and distinction through 3 conflicts across 4 decades. He wore his service record physically, in the set of his shoulders, and the way he moved through a room, the unhurried authority of a man who had spent 40 years being the highest-ranking person present in most situations he entered. He had not commanded in France. His age and his administrative position had kept him in Washington throughout the war, coordinating logistics and personnel for units that were deploying and returning. It was essential work. The Army could not function without the men who performed it. But it was not the same as what the men around him in this room had done. And Whitmore knew this precisely, the way you know a distinction that you have had years to examine from close proximity. He had watched younger officers return from France carrying something he recognized, but had not accumulated in the same quantity. Something that only combat command generates in a man. a particular kind of authority that does not come from rank or experience or institutional position, but from having made decisions under fire and lived with the results. He had been drinking moderately, not enough to impair, but enough to loosen the filter between what he thought and what he said. Both of these facts would contribute to what happened next. He found Patton near a window, in conversation with two other officers from the tank brigades. Whitmore joined the group with the ease of a senior officer accustomed to entering any conversation he chose. The other two officers stepped back slightly, adjusting to accommodate his rank. Patton remained where he was. The conversation moved through the usual channels: the performance of the tank corps at Meuse-Argonne, the tactical limitations that the terrain had imposed, the mechanical failures that had frustrated what should have been breakthrough operations. Patton discussed these matters with the direct specificity of someone who had been in the specific places being discussed. He spoke about tank crew training, about the gap between what the machines were theoretically capable of and what the roads and mud and maintenance realities allowed in practice. He was precise and unsentimental about the failures as well as the successes, the quality of a man who has processed hardship by understanding it rather than by mythologizing it. Whitmore listened. He contributed observations from the administrative perspective: supply chain realities, the equipment allocation difficulties that had constrained deployment schedules, the personnel pipeline issues that had affected training timelines. These were legitimate contributions, and Patton acknowledged them with the courtesy appropriate to a junior officer in conversation with a general. But something in the dynamic was bothering Whitmore. He could not have articulated it precisely in that moment, but it had to do with the way Patton occupied space in the conversation, not aggressively, not disrespectfully, but with a self-possession that did not defer to rank in the way Whitmore expected. Patton listened to Whitmore's points and responded to them with equal weight rather than automatic elevation. There was no insubordination in it, but there was a quality of earned equality that Whitmore found uncomfortable in a way he had no entirely rational justification for finding uncomfortable. He had also been listening to the stories for months. Patton at Saint-Mihiel, Patton at Meuse-Argonne, Patton wounded and commanding from the ground, the tank brigade that had performed better than any comparable unit in the campaign. He had heard the stories told by enough different people that he believed them, and believing them created in him a specific discomfort. The discomfort of a man who has spent his career in the ranks of the serious and suddenly finds himself in the presence of someone operating at a different altitude entirely, and who cannot entirely conceal from himself that he recognizes the difference. The wine, the evening, the specific vulnerability of that recognition combined at the wrong moment. Whitmore set down his glass. He looked at Patton with the expression of a man who believes he is about to say something that puts things in their proper order. "You talk well for a man who has commanded armor for 8 months, Whitmore said. "The tank corps is new and your results were good. But 8 months is not a career, Patton. Come back and talk to me when you have commanded something through a real war. Not a campaign, a war. The kind that takes years. The kind that breaks armies. What you have done is a footnote. Impressive, perhaps, but a footnote." The other two officers went very still. The room around them continued at its normal volume. The band had resumed playing. Conversations continued on all sides, but in the specific radius of those 4 men, something had shifted enough to be felt. Patton looked at Whitmore for a moment without speaking. His pale eyes moved over the general's face with the same quality they applied to terrain, reading, assessing, locating the specific information that was relevant. He did not look angry. He did not look hurt. He looked, if anything, like a man encountering a problem that requires thought before it requires response. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, not deferential, quiet in the way that precision is quiet, because it does not require volume to carry. He said, "General, you are correct that 8 months is not a career. I do not claim a career. I claim 8 months of tank command in 2 of the most difficult operations of this war, and I will take the results of those 8 months against anything comparable in the same theater. I am not here to argue about what I have accomplished. I am here to tell you that what I accomplished was sufficient to teach me what I need to learn next. And what I need to learn next is not taught in Washington or in ceremonies. It is taught in the field." He paused, then continued. "You are correct that I have not commanded through a war that took years and broke armies. I intend to correct that. I have studied every commander in this war who commanded at the level you are describing, and I can tell you with specific accuracy who among them understood armor, and who did not, who understood maneuver and who did not, and who will be studied by military historians in 50 years. and who will not. I am 33 years old. There will be another war. History does not produce one major conflict per century and then retire. When that war comes, I intend to command at the level you are describing. And I intend to do this not because I am talking about it tonight, but because for the next 20 years I will be preparing for it with the same intensity that I applied to the 8 months you are dismissing as a footnote. He picked up his glass, looked at Whitmore with the same direct, unpressured gaze. A footnote, he said, that you just spent 4 minutes discussing with me. He inclined his head with exact correctness, the precise minimum that courtesy required toward a superior officer. Then he returned to the conversation with the 2 tank officers, as if the exchange had concluded, which it had, and as if it had resolved itself in the only direction that the available evidence supported, which it had also done. Whitmore stood for a moment in the space that the response had created around him. The 2 junior officers were looking somewhere else. The band played on. Somewhere behind him, an army colonel was laughing at something that had nothing to do with any of this. He picked up his glass and moved to another part of the room. What Patton said that night about preparation was not rhetorical. It was a statement of operational intent delivered in a social setting, which was entirely consistent with the way he thought about every waking hour of his life. He understood something about the relationship between preparation and performance that most men of his era understood intellectually, but did not apply with the same systematic intensity that he applied to everything. In the years following Fort Myer, he studied, not casually, not as professional requirement, but with the obsessive, comprehensive focus of a man who believes that war is a discipline that can be mastered through sufficient application of intelligence and effort. He studied Hannibal. He studied Napoleon, not the biography but the campaigns, the orders of march, the logistical calculations, the timing of decisive engagements. He studied Rommel before Rommel was Rommel. He studied the development of armored doctrine in Germany and in Britain and compared it to the American understanding, and found the American understanding wanting, and said so in writing in papers that his superiors largely ignored and that were later held up as evidence that he had predicted much of what the next war would require. He studied cavalry tactics because the principles of cavalry translated directly to armored maneuver: speed, surprise, exploitation of gaps rather than confrontation of strength. He understood this when most of his contemporaries were still debating whether the tank was a support weapon for the infantry or a weapon system capable of independent decisive action. He knew the answer because he had done the mathematics of what a properly employed armored force could achieve against a defensive position that was not organized to meet it. He also trained his body with the same methodical intensity. He remained one of the physically fittest officers in the American Army through his 40s. He believed and stated openly in ways that made his colleagues increasingly uncomfortable that a commander's physical condition was a direct reflection of his mental discipline and his moral authority over the men he commanded. A soft commander, in his view, was an operational liability regardless of his formal qualifications. The war that he had predicted came in 1939. The United States entered it in 1941, and the sequence of commands that followed, North Africa, Sicily, the breakout across France, the march into Germany, constituted the career in full war that Whitmore had told him he lacked. Third Army covered more ground faster than any comparable force in the history of mechanized warfare. The relief of Bastogne in December 1944, executed in 72 hours through conditions that military planners had told him were impossible, was the operational equivalent of what he had demonstrated in France a quarter-century earlier: precision, speed, will applied to a problem that had been declared unsolvable. Harold Whitmore retired from the Army in 1922. He died in 1936, 9 years before the liberation of Paris. He did not live to see the appendix become the text. Patton died in December 1945 from injury sustained in a car accident in occupied Germany. He died that characteristic death, not in combat, not by enemy action, but in the specific unguarded moment that finds even the most prepared men eventually. He was 60 years old. He had commanded in the war he had promised to be ready for, and had performed in it at a level that required the invention of new comparative standards because the existing ones were insufficient to describe what he had done. At Fort Myer in 1919, in a room full of men who had just survived the First World War, a general told a lieutenant colonel that what he had accomplished was a footnote, and the lieutenant colonel had said, "I am 33 years old. There will be another war, and I will be ready for it." It took 22 years, but ready is not a temporary condition. It is the accumulation of every day between the promise and the moment. and some men are constitutionally incapable of accumulating those days at less than full intensity. For those men, the waiting is not waiting, it is the preparation. And the preparation, when the moment finally arrives, looks effortless to everyone who was not watching the 22 years that preceded it. The footnote in the end ran longer than the book.